I would like to welcome Carrie George to join us and take us through the last session of the day, which is creating interoperability for digital invoices via mobile money. Welcome, Carrie.
Thank you so much, and I really appreciate being here today and having this opportunity. I'm going to operate between a few different media. We had a lot of people around the world that we wanted to bring in, so I did some brief interviews with them just because of time zones, childcare, and all the like. But I do have full interviews of these that I'll make available to anyone who's interested, just to give more context to what we're doing and why we're interested in Mojo Loop and Mojo Loop activities, but specifically interoperability and exchange of digital invoices from mobile money connectivity. So let me open my screen and share now. So a quick executive summary of what I'll be discussing today. Simply that we're looking at a number of different technologies as well as partnerships for the exchange of data to make supply chain reporting and supply chain and product level claims more accurate. And then ultimately that by making claims more accurate, efficient reporting, that will lead and start with improved conservation, economic inclusion, and social and human rights impact. What we're looking at is because of the over 100 million livelihoods that are dependent specifically on small scale production of artisanally mined material, but that there's a number of different critical risks, including that most miners are reporting 50% or less of the actual payment. And there's a number of reasons for that I'll go into, but that we've seen that now, especially with mobile money being so ubiquitous throughout sub-Saharan Africa and much of the global south, where artisanal miners are most prevalent, that there's an opportunity to leapfrog some of the issues of payment and then also the support to actually track fair payment and also implement income improvement programs. What we've been doing, we've been operating across a number of countries on artisanal mining and looking at what would a typical SMS-based receipt, so just what you get in your text, include, and what we need for supply chain tracking and identification of product, as well as ensuring know your customer and anti-money laundering practices. The data that's either in that digital receipt, that SMS-based receipt, or in part of the transaction itself, are all part of what we would need to be able to support supply chain and product level tracking and improvement programs. Why this is so critical and why miners and small scale producers globally can't do this is on their own without this type of digitization is it's just too cumbersome. A single miner could be supporting and contributing to product and materials for product that go into some of the biggest products and biggest producers in the world. I used to be the head of Responsible Minerals for Apple, leading programs that covered over 40 different materials, and artisanal mining and this issue around getting legitimate and credible documentation from them was too cumbersome for them to do on their own. And especially when you have big organizations like that asking for that information, it's overwhelming. What we want to do is enable them so that it's seamless in their transactions and that anyone that they would like to empower would have it, but also enabling their own privacy. And we've already seen some success in this. So we've seen success across a project that we've done in Tanzania, as well as an organization with Virtue Gems, driving improvements throughout the supply chain. And all this is getting them the right connections to the markets, ensuring that they're able to give the documentation necessary to those market actors, and moving forward with what they would be transparent payments for their own decision making in that payment realm. This is the high level, but let me quickly just share with you one of the videos we did briefly so that you can kind of get that view.
Activities such as cutting, polishing, and grading. Welcome to the Everledger Provenance Platform. This platform is designed to capture the provenance information of diamonds, gemstones, and jewelry pieces. The provenance data traces the colored gem back to its origin within the earth. The trail of provenance continues through to the customer and eventual owner. This includes information on how the colored gem was created through activities such as cutting, polishing, and grading. Working with Everledger, supply chain stakeholders must meet specific data requirements and transparency standards for sustainability claims. Our governance guidelines are enhancing trust within the industry in areas of social and environmental sustainability for all provenance data. Customers can view the entire provenance story of their diamonds and gemstone by securely logging in with their credentials. They can also transfer ownership of the stones within their account. In future, they will be able to gift the gemstones to new owners, along with the associated provenance information. With the Everledger Provenance Platform, customers have greater confidence in the value and authenticity of their gemstone. Everledger is applying many of its learning from diamonds now to colored gems. A key difference in colored gems provenance is that 80% of colored gems are produced by artisanal and small-scale miners. These miners are often informal, distributed across many regions, and may operate without commercial documentation, chain of custody practices, and legal licenses. Given that mobile money accounts are often utilized more than traditional accounts, we see a unique opportunity to skip paper-based accounting altogether. Everledger is developing relationships with mobile money providers to allow for miners to give consent to loading digital invoices, geolocation, and customer details directly from their mobile account to our blockchain. Using existing mobile technology, we believe this makes our solution low-cost and readily usable. This is the first of many solutions we want to apply to the artisanal mining sector. From low-tech solutions for applying machine vision to identify stones to creating more efficient ways to tip the producer, our aim is to improve the industry overall. Everledger, supporting artisanal and small-scale producers to be legitimately recognized and financially rewarded.
Just an example of some of the work that we've been working to enable across the supply chain. But let me give you a quick background on our company, led by our fearless leader, Leanne Kemp. Our focus on transparency, trust, and sustainability in marketplaces and throughout supply chains is key. We've been operating since 2014. We're most known for blockchain and diamonds, but what we're looking at is marketplaces and supply chain credibility. We recently have been awarded a grant, for example, with the U.S. Department of Energy on collecting batteries and incentivizing battery collection throughout the United States in order to capture and prevent capture critical materials from batteries, but also prevent pollution from consumer e-waste specifically. So there's a wide variety of different technologies that we're using in the marketplace and in supply chains. And that does require us as well to, this isn't a one solution that we enable, but that we're looking at multiple types of partnerships, and that includes with NGOs on the ground, as you saw in the video, in our work in Tanzania, as well as in Kenya, Zambia, and other countries. Why this is critical, I want to bring up just a little bit of my history. As I was looking at the critical materials for Apple, we also were confronted with some of the issues with cobalt sector and cobalt mining in DR Congo. I had been working on critical and conflict minerals for over a decade at that point. This wasn't a surprise, but in order to engage on it, and because the media had become such a substantial part of this discussion, we had to take a stronger stance on it. Artisanal and small-scale production of cobalt has represented anywhere between 100% of cobalt production virtually in the 90s and during severe conflict zones, and then now it's about anywhere from 20 to 30% or more. And when you're looking at OECD, UN guiding principles and other things, they require a certain amount of due diligence, and that means claims, evidence of those claims, and material tracking. Our product is to bring a lot of these different types of activities together and the different types of documentation. It's not a small activity, it's quite cumbersome, it's quite costly in many respects, and that's why we have to do a number of different types of technologies, document sets, and different types of inputs. For example, at my company, at one point, I was carrying over 12 people just to do the activities we were doing. But that was just one subset of it. That's too costly for most companies to do, let alone then actually trying to drive the impact you want to have in the supply chain. So again, what we're looking at: accurate product claims, efficient reporting, and the improved conservation and economic inclusion at the end of the supply chain and throughout the supply chain. And these efficiencies we can see through a number of different examples of different types of technologies we've applied, and then accuracy in others. And we can go into those in more detail, but just one example is in just one single load, we were able to identify even just 25 documents with critical errors. And this is these documents in this case were specific types of certificates that carried commercial data. In the case of digital invoices, these types of invoices are critical to be able to tie two actors, the two from sender receiver together, as well as the type of and amount of material and dates, to make sure there is a reasonable due diligence and chain of custody that can be established. So let's talk a little bit more about social inclusion and again, why this sector is so critical. I named how critical and how many of these miners feed so many of our products today. But let's talk a little bit just about how these miners compare to large scale miners. 40+ million men, women, and children work in the artisanal mining sector. 100 to 150 or 200 million livelihoods are dependent on it. In large scale mining, we're looking at a contrast of 3.7 million and only 29 to 59 million livelihoods. Large scale mining for livelihoods is still very important, but exponentially different in terms of people and people impact. If you look at the countries and across the world, how big of a impact this is globally, obviously substantial. And then when you look also at the sectors, cobalt represents 20 or to 30% at any time. You have gold, where you have 20+%, mica, 25+%, tin, 25+%, and colored gems, a large 80% of the world right now is mined with artisanal miners. Why we've focused on our gemstones then is no shock. Because we had some work in the diamond sector and jewelry sector already, we were focused on gemstones. And that's one of the reasons that we've established these partnerships with so many different artisanal mining groups across East Africa particularly, and then into Sri Lanka and India. But let's talk about some of the key problems and access to livelihoods, fair payment, and some of the impacts. Artisanal miners are often illegal, operating informally. 30% or less women are operating artisanal mining, but a number of limitations prevent them from getting into the artisanal mining sector. And there's critical risk, child labor, health and safety risk, pollution, et cetera. I'm going to have one more interview with Fairphone. Fairphone is an organization we've worked with for some time now. They have been engaging with Everledger in the capacity of both our Department of Energy pilot, as well as working on different potential technologies that we would want to apply across their supply chains. And I'll let them speak to this.
As driving better practices with the large-scale mining across the world. I am going to kick off with just asking Tirza and Jerusalem to split up a response and give us a few examples of best practices and change that you've been trying to engage on in the artisanal and small-scale mining world, and in what commodities.
Fairphone started out as an awareness-raising campaign for conflict minerals. And since then, we've been working really to improving the conditions in ASM, acknowledging that conflict minerals, but also cobalt, are often mined artisanally.
At the moment, we are engaged in improvement programs related to artisanal mined gold and cobalt. Gold, our engagement started already in 2017, so it's a program that's been running for 3 years. And cobalt is a relatively new program that we started with, let's say, in full swing in the middle of this 2020. In terms of best practices, I would rather say that this breaks down into three key elements or three components. The first element would be the approach that we take into looking at, let's say, issues and problems of ISM mining that are happening on site, so at the mine operation itself, as well as what is happening at the wider community. So in a sense, by looking broadly about what is happening at the ISM level, we use a kind of landscape approach in which we don't just address the problems at the mining operations, but we also analyze the relationship between the mine operations and the community around. As a second key element that we pay attention to is basically the sense or the notion of a continuous improvement plan. So this idea comes from the fact that in our relationship with ISM is one in which Fairphone doesn't or wouldn't expect the ISM operations to be 100% perfect at the point in which we start engaging with them. But we rather take a more realistic approach and we say we will already start engaging with you at the point in which the ISM operation also commits to a continuous improvement path.
And we have about 20 minutes of that interview. Unfortunately, I cut it down just in order to make sure we had enough time for some of the other discussions here. But Tirza and Jersam work extensively in the artisanal mining sector, as Jersam mentioned, in cobalt as well as in Ugandan gold. And so I'm going to just pull apart some of the cobalt activities and engagement. As mentioned, there's critical risks in child labor, forced labor, community health, indigenous rights, safety risks, et cetera, and so many different materials. And some of the work that Fairphone has worked on with cobalt, some of the different reasons that they've seen children mine is because there's no other work available. They still have to pay for school fees, and that children are supporting themselves.
When you're looking at the mitigation and resolution of that, oftentimes you're looking at child removal from the location, and that you remediate with local NGOs and others that are supporting children either getting remedial education, or in the case of others, just being able to get back into school or support school fees. This is a picture of one of those organizations called Bon Pasteur. When we're looking at why worker safety is at risk or other community health issues, pollution levels in many of the mining areas are very high. This can be air pollution, this can be water pollution, et cetera, and a lack of PPE, and there's a number of reasons for that. But oftentimes this has to do with not having enough money to pay for different types of equipment or PPE or other types of prevention measures for the pollution. We're working with a student at Cornell and have been working with the University of Michigan on several different projects as well, talking about why miners and how miners are paid, the different types of lack of information they're getting on the actual market prices, their market power, so that they're oftentimes separated, a lot of middlemen, and that they're operating a cashless infrastructure, so that sometimes they just have to take whatever money is available to them. I've had several miners talk to me about, even though the middleman or the broker said they only had 20% of the payment that they needed, that they were owed, they had to take it because it was needed that day, and so they took whatever they could get, and oftentimes that meant they wouldn't necessarily get paid back. There are different types of standards that are out there that are looking at fair pay, but it's the logistics and how to then actually monitor this when you're operating in a cashless economy oftentimes. So these standards can actually do a lot if they're still operating without any way to actually check back on these types of payments and payment practices. So we've been looking at different solutions, and mobile money came up again and again as one of the first ones we would have to implement before we would implement anything else, because it's so dependent on actually setting up that first chain of custody, that actual payment structure, enabling the miner to actually sell into a legitimate market. And let me just quickly play an interview with Monica Monica has been working with us. She's a brilliant woman based in Nairobi, has been working in the mining sector for decades and has supported many different types of buyers that are looking to buy from legitimate and fair and set up fair payment systems in a lot of these gem sectors, as well as gold and other materials. So let me go to that.
Thanks, Terry. Good to be here. I'm Monica Yishuhe. I work in the mineral supply chains in Africa. I mainly work with artisanal and small-scale miners, assisting with the responsible sourcing. Currently, my focus is on gemstones and gold supply chains in Africa. Recently, due to the pandemic, the program we are working on is called the Virtual Gem, where we've partnered with some responsible jewelers from America to try and keep the supply chain going for artisanal miners by taking the business digital and trying to harness the benefits of technology to ensure that their trade doesn't stop because of the pandemic, really making sure they don't become more vulnerable than they already are due to lack of markets. Which is what was the greatest effect of the pandemic. The markets just stopped. Yeah, so that's in short what we're doing, Karen. So an artisan miner by characteristic would be more often than not unlicensed in their operation. By law, actually, artisanal miners at times are recognized as not using any form of mechanization in the extraction of their minerals. So they're said to be using rudimentary sort of tools for extraction. An artisanal miner normally, much as we call them a miner, is normally mining for survival, not as a business. It's more of an entrepreneur of necessity. Lives in an area where maybe mining happened or has migrated due to poverty to an area where there's been a find, and that means you have to extract. So some of them don't actually view themselves as a business. They just see themselves as making a living from an economic activity that has sort of emerged, right? So then that characterizes them to be very informal in their setup and in their operation. And hence why there is such a big move globally where everybody's talking about formalization of artisan miner because of the number of people, the number of livelihoods it impacts, and the potential economic benefit it would have if it was well structured and formalized to make it a bit safer for the miners to operate in the sort of environments they find themselves in. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think a lot of the time when we speak about trying to give technology and technology to artisanal miners, everybody laughs like out loud because people who've seen like where they operate and who they are and their literacy levels think that it's really crazy. What blockchain, what are you trying to do, right? And I think that's some of what we saw when we went down to the villages in Tanzania. And they were very curious. What are you trying to do using these laptops and phones, when we are selling? You'll appreciate for most of them, the fact that they have a mobile phone is that's as close as how technology has penetrated, because other systems like the banking systems consider them unbankable, right? Yeah. So they'll not be in the formal sort of banking channels. So for them, a mobile phone is infrastructure and technology that has come to the village for them. Yeah. So now trying to see what else could be done on their phone was really amazing, and for them to understand that, right? So just
back to the presentation. Obviously, this group can appreciate why mobile money is necessary. We've seen so many different opportunities for how this enables, the infrastructure that we want to connect with, but also mobile money that there are most of these miners whose literacy levels and education may be lower. They've already been familiarized with this type of technology. Again, we know that the most of what is needed to help them enter a legitimate market is already part of the transaction history in mobile payments. And so when we came across Mojo Loop, we were so impressed by this opportunity and wanted to make sure that this audience appreciated how big of an opportunity this was for supply chain managers globally to be able to accept this material, that these people could be being paid 2, 3, up to 10 times what they're currently being paid by entering legitimate markets, because currently most of the illegitimate markets that they're operating are at a lower rate. And that this is desperately needed by industries across the world that are dependent in some form or fashion on artisanal mining. We've never found an opportunity. In addition, we would love to be able to connect on other opportunities like small scale loans and credit histories. I'll share with you quickly a quick video about how many people globally want to be able to provide payments to people producing and making sure that they're getting fair payment, but also tips where necessary or where possible. And as well as reducing fees that currently, when you're talking about exchanges across the world, there's a lot of fees that are happening to get even cash payments too. And we believe that these types of mobile payments that you're working on would be able to enable a reduction of these fees. I'm just going to quickly play one video from this idea of tipping the producer that's become quite popular, and that we pitched this with Accenture at WEF a few years ago.
The global value in green trade is rising in political and economic importance, topping $2 trillion a year. 2/3 of global consumers are willing to pay more for sustainable goods. Nevertheless, today's economic and social models can still exacerbate inequalities, encourage waste, and increase threats to our environment and health. That's partly because the small producers at the beginning of the sustainable supply chain get a mere sliver of the premium price paid for their goods. What if we could empower consumers to directly reward small-scale suppliers around the world that are committed to following sustainable practices? Imagine the impact if more people could fully participate in the growing value of the green economy.
And, that's the overall idea of what we're trying to do. The difference that we're hoping to enable is that we do this through actual mobile money instead of creating separate apps. There's a lot of organizations out there that we really praise their work, but most of the miners, most of the small scale farmers that we're working with, they don't have oftentimes smartphones that are fully enabled with the opportunity to download an app made in this country or this country. And also there's a lot of different bio data that is being asked for. We're hoping to enable privacy in a continued fashion through mobile money technology, their identity to be disclosed privately, but verified by existing mobile money practices. And that just the transaction data would be able to be given through consent forward. We already are working on different types of incentive structures for collection, as I mentioned, of batteries from consumer markets in North America. And what we would like to do is transfer that same kind of concept to give back to artisanal miners and other small scale producers. We do need this type of connectivity and infrastructure to be able to enable this ultimately through the supply chain. But the idea would be that for all the tracking and data that's going forward to enable that product to be considered legitimate, that we should be able to give back through that same type of connectivity. There's an organization called 8 that is getting quite a lot of press that what they've been doing is they've purchased phones through an organization and that they have given phones to a community that then working through a telecommunications partner, they've been paying these communities just a basic income rate without any sort of conditions attached, and that they're testing whether or not this is equally valuable as a lot of the different types of aid programs that we've done, just because there have been studies that show just a certain percentage of people will use that money wisely regardless. But there's a lot of different goals that this may enable with specific communities and this kind of concept, and a number of downstream brands are looking at this. The idea would be that, money can be combining resources to help transition livelihoods where the mining is particularly dangerous or that certain pits or things are not viable. And similarly, this is from an organization that Fairphone is working with, that for child labor and child labor monitoring, that those could be given to NGOs that are enabling that kind of behavior. So finally, what we need from a digital invoice, I've already discussed that most of it's already embedded in what the transaction data is. I had some of our technologists review a lot of your API and what's available. It doesn't seem to be anything that you wouldn't already be doing as part of your hub, but it's how then that data would be coming to us, and then how we would be able to us or others that are trying to buy, because there's also a number of actors that just buy directly from the miners, but how they would receive that type of receipt ultimately is what we're interested in. I asked our technologists, unfortunately they weren't able to be here today due to other extenuating circumstances, but just to draft up some key constraints and goals that they would have. We would like to be able to discuss this in further capacity through Mojo Loop and others. But we do believe that if certain telecoms are interested, we've been doing research with the University of Michigan, their business school, and we can see that this is an opportunity to bring not only more transactions, but certain actors specifically into telco's environment that haven't been traditionally doing these specific transactions, but have communicated that they would. And that we've been shown that these mobile money transactions over time will definitely produce results for different telcos. We know that technology, and as you guys know as well, technology won't solve all the problems, but technology plus these types of partnerships can have a real impact. And I'll close there. So thank you so much for your time. I hope I left a little bit of time for questions. If there are any, I know it's the end of your day, so people are probably eager to get that evening drink or get off to family and friends, but would welcome any questions that you might have.
Thank you so much, Carrie. I'll wait and see if anybody has any questions, either in the chat or if you want to raise your hands.
Carrie, thank you. This is a great presentation. I really appreciate the detail you went through on this, on the use cases. I'm especially interested, though, in how you would treat the somewhat odd commodity fungibility that exists. That is, one coffee bean is very much like another one. How you treat that through the supply chain. Gemstones are much the same, although they're not. Once they're cut and polished, of course, they're quite unique, but they're not really. If you look at how they're traded by De Beers, they'll bring out a velvet bag and dump a bunch of stones on the table, and they'll trade whichever ones you want. You don't take the others, but you don't actually know where they came from. How do you identify uniquely the polished stone or the pound of coffee or the whatever it is, as it first has to be placed on the blockchain in raw form, and then as it moves through its finishing chain out through distribution? How does it remain linked in that way, and how did you identify it? Is there a process for that that's somewhat the same, or is it just unique to each industry?
Absolutely. Miller, you just hit about 12 great questions. Sorry. I'm just going to give, no, they're really great. And I'm going to give you a kind of lumped answer, but I'm going to try to make it so it actually responds to as many of those as possible. The answer is yes and no to a lot of it. And that's, it sounds like a cop-out, but bear with me. I talk about blockchain and blockchain uses in supply chains in kind of 3 layers. I say there's a layer of commercial transaction that we're tracking. We're tracking individual identity and behavior between that and permissioning that. We're tracking practices. And then we're tracking actual product and product origin. So there's different reasons people are tracking the data. And some of that's for regulatory matters, some of that's for financial concerns, some of it is for certain types of claims, but each one is separate. And so there's going to be different ways you track that. As you can probably deduce, tracking financial transactions and holding those in a permission form are a lot easier and a little bit more cut and dry than when you're actually combining materials. In the world of chain of custody management, there's actually a lot of methods for what you're talking about. It's about how you claim it then in the end. So if it's a mixed good, there's honestly many different types of ways to do this. I'll just give you a handful for true experts here. It will want to slice and dice me for making this so simplified, but there's book and claim, there's mass balance, there's a whole bunch of different ways to do that. But how you as a consumer would see it when you look at like your Forest Stewardship Council claims, when you look at recycled paper, it'll say something simplified like mixed. It'll say 100% this. It'll have something that will summarize the type of claim structure and chain of custody modeling that it's used. And for people trying to do that well, they will try to make it as explicit as possible. Like, was that being accounted for? Or was this mixed? Or was this some sort of other modeling? And in blockchain, you can do any number of those. So I won't make any comments about De Beers or the diamond industry broadly. There are diamonds that are tracked very specifically. There are melee stones that are not. But and there is a lot of commoditization that occurs. So to your point, there can be mixing and there cannot. And that's what we're trying to distinguish is say apples for apples and oranges and separate, and make sure that's really clear. But that's a yes and a no and a really pat answer, but I can go into a lot more detail. I actually did a mining seminar kind of talking a little bit about that. So happy to share that video with you sometime.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. That largely answers my question. I think that it comes down in the end then to the challenge at the place at which the claim is first made. In the blockchain environment, we're essentially combining a hard to test claim with an unassailable claim that allows it to go forward. So if somebody says, yeah, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, I just put a whole truckload of forest certified lumber on that truck, only it wasn't actually that. It was actually out of that, the deep forest, but I'm going to make the claim anyway. And so figuring out where the corruption can enter the system, I think is a key to that. But once that's been done and you put extra effort on it, then it sounds like you have ways of, well, the industry, whatever industry it is, has ways of tying the physical good to the recorded claim as it's carried through. Is that basically that's
the idea? And what we're trying to do is also create things like confidence levels, risk areas, and other things like that. So absolutely. I'm simplifying it, but that's absolutely a lot of it. And one of the reasons, though, for artisanal miners, small scale producers in general, in order to avoid that risk and that concern, what companies do is they will just blatantly ban them from supply chains, which is the highest risk factor for highly vulnerable populations to just be blatantly banned. And sometimes it's as ridiculous as saying just banning Africa. I mean, ridiculous things that happen that I've had to unwind throughout my career to say that, one, you can't do that. There's far too much commerce and material that comes from a continent. But that we need to track this back to how we can do this effectively. And that's ultimately what we're trying to do is create a confidence to start bringing it into market in a specific way, as opposed to just a random truckload here and there and, one niche project and that sort of thing.
Right. No, it makes a lot of sense. Thank you. I very much like to see how this might work in the future, because we have the same concern on the money side, where large money center banks will, quote, de-risk their balance sheet by not doing business with banks whose veracity they can't test to their own levels of understanding. Of course, that impacts the very people we're trying to serve the most.
Exactly.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Awesome. Carrie, I see one more question in the chat from Ross Graham, which is, with non-smartphones, how do you verify that the transaction is with the correct participant? What about satisfying KYC, AML, ATF regulatory requirements?
Exactly. That's what the pain point is. If you don't have any sort of digitization of these transactions, people are doing this in a very manual effort. So nonprofits have contracted, and a lot of times these are big nonprofits from Washington, D.C. and the UK, and they have affiliates or their groups going in. And I praise what they've done, but it's not scalable. They have, millions and millions of dollars going into just literally tracking and then verifying individual miners in transactions. But these are transitory environments. These are constant shifts of markets. Artisanal miners, as Monica pointed out, this is not an entrepreneur of choice typically, as much as necessity. And so, they will be doing farming one day and then mining when it's higher prices and that sort of thing. So without this type of engagement, it's just been 100% manual. When I was at Apple, I did sponsor an NGO that I think we gave like 50 iPads to, where they were registering miners and having solar panels on the back going into like some really deep parts of DR Congo. That's still just not enough. Now as mobile money payments and even just SMS based payments it doesn't have to be a full smartphone enablement, but if we just have enough, that's where we're thinking we're having it. And even in Tanzania, I was 5 hours outside of Arusha, where our truck had popped 3 tires kind of thing, and on the way. And almost every person in the village had an SMS-based phone or smartphone. So it's not going to solve every miners, but it could solve, I would say, a huge percentage, and getting them into a legitimate market and have that scale from there.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Carrie. I'm going to end it there, and I will ask everyone to continue the conversation in Discourse. The link is posted there. This brings us to the end of day 2. Thank you all so much for joining us and for participating. Just a couple of housekeeping items. One, all the video recordings for yesterday's session are up on YouTube. You can access them either through the session links on Discourse or on the agenda page. Everything is linked there. And all the slides for today's program are also linked in the agenda, with the recording soon to follow. So if you missed anything or you wanted to watch something again or catch up with, view a slide that you might have missed, that's your opportunity. Please go and grab it there. The link to the agenda page is mojaloop.io/Dex. Dex is DECKS. Excellent.